Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know Senator Daniel Webster took center stage in Congress once again, delivering a blistering defense of the Tariff of 1828 during the debate over nullification, getting everyone all worked up all over again for years to come? That Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun had a very awkward encounter at Thomas Jefferson's birthday party that was the beginning of the end for these two former friends. And that President Jackson threatened to kill every single nullifier in South Carolina, and then passed a law that gave him the right to do just that. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will cover that and more in episode 123, the Nullification Debate. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 123, the Nullification Debate. Real quick before we dive into our episode, just a couple things I want to announce. First off, thank you to the newest of patrons, Brian, Joseph, and Steve. Signed up joining the honor roll level, which I really appreciate, and Guy signed up at the teacher's pet level. Thank you so much to these four gentlemen and signing up to support the show. It really means a ton, and to be totally honest with you, especially during these quarantine times, I know financially things are very difficult for many, so it really means a lot that you guys have signed up to support the show, and that is what allows me to continue to take time away from family and my other hobbies, which are pretty much non-existent at this point, in order to keep doing this show. So if you like the show, if you're learning something along with us and are willing and able to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/ateachershistory to do just that. All right. The book recommendation for today is a book that I love. And if something that we cover if this episode intrigues you and you want to learn more about it, I would highly recommend this book, Prelude to the Civil War, The Nullification Controversy in South Carolina, 1816 to 1836. Much of the information I have in this episode comes from that, and I would highly recommend it. And by the way, that's by William Freeling, Freehling. So Prelude to Civil War, Nullification Controversy in South Carolina, 1816 to 1836 by William W. Freeling. All right, so last episode we detailed the first address of Jackson's presidency in December of 1829. We touched briefly on some of his bigger ideas and agenda items that he planned on executing. If nothing else, Jackson proved to everyone that his presidency was going to be action-packed. After we finished detailing all of the controversial stances that Jackson was going to be taking throughout his first term, we then transitioned into more detail on the impending nullification crisis, laying the groundwork for what will become quite the rivalry between John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson. So, just for timeline purposes, the South Carolina exposition and protest, which I mentioned last week, was written in December of 1828, prior to Jackson even stepping into the White House. There were about 5,000 copies of it made and spread all throughout South Carolina. This means that during the Petticoat Affair, which we covered previously, the controversy in 1829, and the disruption of Jackson's cabinet throughout 1829 into 1830, Calhoun was working behind the scenes to undermine the federal government's authority. You know, the federal government he was working in as the Vice President of the United States, which, by the way, is exactly what Jefferson did with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And for the record, Jefferson wasn't the only one who authored them. I think that's how I've been portraying it this week and last week. But if you go back to the episodes in which we talked about them, you know that's not the case because James Madison played just as big of a role. And it's actually believed by most historians that Jefferson wrote Kentucky's resolutions and Madison wrote Virginia's. Oh, and one last thing on them. Some historians will argue that, yes, while Madison and Jefferson did use the phrase null and void when referencing the Alien and Sedition Acts and other federal laws, they, deemed them unconstitutional, but they stopped a bit short of directly declaring that the states had the power of nullification. And, I mean, historians go back and forth on that, but some will argue that, you can definitely bring Jefferson and Madison and their resolutions into this nullification context, but they didn't go quite as far as the South Carolinians did, so it's not quite an apples-to-apples comparison. Just wanted to point that out. Anyway, I bring up the timeline of events of the nullification crisis and the fact that the South Carolina Exposition was written in December 1828, and the Petticoat Affair was throughout 1829 and 1830, to point out to you that this nullification debate, this nullification crisis, was not something that happened overnight. The tension that was created through this and the devolution of the personal and professional friendship between Jackson and Calhoun was something that happened really over like a 4-year period, basically the entire first term of Jackson's presidency. And Calhoun knew this wouldn't be an overnight process, predicting that, quote, "The next 2 or 3 years will be the deepest interest to us and the whole Union." After the exposition failed to pick up momentum, at least as much momentum as the South Carolinians hoped it would at the beginning of Jackson's presidency, the representatives from South Carolina doubled down and refused to let this issue go unresolved. And let's take a look at what's going on in South Carolina that prompted many of these South Carolinians to be so passionate about this issue. During the 1820s, South Carolina had been hit pretty hard with the economic downturn, seeing about 15% of its population, both white and African American slave, leaving the state. The Panic of 1819 had hit South Carolina hard, and for a variety of reasons, its recovery was slow. On top of this, there were some areas of South Carolina that had extremely high ratios of African American slaves to whites, which instilled more fear in the ruling class and made them extra sensitive to any type of criticism of the institution of slavery. Not only this, but this wasn't South Carolina's first foray into the concept of nullification. In 1822, so we're talking 6 years before the South Carolina Exposition, South Carolina passed a law that was deemed unconstitutional by Supreme Court Justice William Johnson, who at the time was serving in his capacity as a circuit court judge. What did South Carolina do? They ignored it and enforced the law anyway. Following the passage of the Tariff of 1828, South Carolinians gathered in caucuses to try to figure out a way to garner broad Southern support for their cause. John C. Calhoun, the Vice President of the United States at that time, and the man that most of the South Carolinians looked up to, was asked by the South Carolina State Legislature to prepare a report on the tariff. This is what became known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest that we have mentioned a few times now. Following the publishing of the South Carolina Exposition, a captivating orator and South Carolina radical named Robert Rhett spoke publicly of the dangers of South Carolinians standing idly by and allowing the tariff to continue to be enforced, declaring, quote, "But if you are doubtful of yourselves, if you are not prepared to follow up your principles wherever they may lead, to the very last consequence, if you love life better than honor, prefer ease to perilous liberty and glory, awake not, stir not, impotent resistance will add vengeance to your ruin. Live in smiling peace with your insatiable oppressors, and die with the noble consolation that your submissive patience will survive triumphant your beggary and despair. On the heels of Rhett's rhetoric and the victory of Jackson in the presidential election of 1828, many expected this momentum to continue, forcing drastic change in American policy. But that was not what was happening, unfortunately, for the South Carolinian nullifiers. In January of 1830, just over a year after the South Carolina Exposition and Protest was penned and distributed, a senatorial debate reignited the issue, bringing increased national attention to it. Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts got into a verbal spar on the Senate floor with Senator Robert Hayne from South Carolina over this nullification issue. And this is worth taking a look into because these two men do a good job summarizing the feelings of the two competing political factions at the time, specifically with regard to this tariff issue. And during 1830, Robert Hayne took over as one of the loudest voices for nullification, knowing that Calhoun's position as vice president was a bit of a delicate spot for him to be in. Thus, he wasn't able to speak as freely or openly as he would have wanted to. Hayne, well, he only had to answer to the people of South Carolina, so he didn't hold back. Hayne took up the mantle of a proud Democrat and reignited debate over the 10th Amendment and the power of the states. Hayne's perspective was that while some Northerners were accusing the South of being anti-American or being too obstinate in the growth and progress of the nation, Hayne disagreed. He argued that this tariff and the consolidation of money and power in the federal government was forcing Southerners like himself to take a strong stand against it. He never asked for this tariff. In fact, when the tariff was being debated, men like Hayne begged and pleaded not to have it passed, knowing what type of effect it would have on the South. Yet, did anyone listen to him? Did anyone in the North care about how negatively it was impacting Hayne's constituents and their businesses? Hayne was exasperated, complaining that, quote, "Good God, has it come to this? Do gentlemen value so lightly the peace and harmony of the country? Do gentlemen estimate the value of the Union at so low a price that they will not even make one effort to bind the states together with cords of affection? If so, let me tell gentlemen, the seeds of dissolution are already sown, and our children will reap the bitter fruit." And just as a side note, every time he says gentlemen, he's referring to his fellow members of Congress. Webster then indignantly responded. For 3 days, Webster's response went on for 3 days. And I'm not going to read you all of his responses, I'm sure you could imagine. But Webster supported the right of the government to not only pass legislation and enforce it, he also accused the South, specifically South Carolina, of picking a fight they had no legitimate grounds, only creating more division in the nation. Webster responded by saying, quote, "It is to the Union that we owe our safety at home and our consideration and dignity abroad. It is to the Union that we are chiefly indebted for whatever makes us most proud of our country. The Union hasn't come easily. It was born of war and the derangements that followed war, but it has proved a benediction to Americans of every section. It has been to us all a copious foundation of national, social, and personal happiness." Webster then pivoted and began to paint a picture of his fellow senators of a world where nullification was successful and the Union as they knew it was destroyed. Quote, "God grant that in my last day at least the curtain may not rise. God grant that on my vision never may be opened what lies behind. When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, May I not see him shining on the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious union, on states dissevered, discordant, belligerent, on a land rent with civil feuds or drenched it may be in fraternal blood. Let their last feeble and lingering glance rather behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, now known and honored throughout the earth. Still full high advanced, its arms and trophies streaming in their original luster, not a stripe erased or polluted, nor a single star obscured. Bearing for its motto no such miserable interrogatory as, "What is it all worth?" Nor those other words of delusion and folly, liberty first and union afterwards, but everywhere, spread all over in characters of living light, blazing on all its ample folds as they float over the sea and over the land, and in every wind under the whole heavens. The other sentiment, dear to every true American heart, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Now, I know that the quote I just read from Webster was a long one, so thanks for sticking with me. But it's important, because when we hear arguments posed by both Webster and Hayne, you begin to better understand why this tariff and subsequent nullification issue was such an important debate at this time. And this is because both men were presenting arguments that, yes, did have to deal directly with the tariff, but also had bigger picture principled perspectives on the roles of and relationship between the federal government and the states. So let's break it down real quick. When it came to the tariff, we know what Hayne's argument is. Men like Calhoun and Hayne felt wronged by the passage of the tariff. They believed that this tariff was passed either intentionally or unintentionally to hurt the southern economy and prop up the northern economy. From their perspective, it was a partisan hack job that was specifically aimed to favor some Americans over others. Because of that, and because of the 10th Amendment, Southerners believed it was an unconstitutional power grab by Northern representatives, and therefore they shouldn't have to submit to it. On the other hand, men like Webster and his fellow Northern congressional colleagues just flat out disagreed with this premise. They believed that the tariff was both constitutional and beneficial for the nation. In order for America to continue to grow in power and influence, they had to ensure that they weren't going to be a glorified version of an English colony. Therefore, they had to protect the growing manufacturing that had been bored out of the necessity during the war. The tariff was simply, in their minds, the best thing for America. Period. Now, this all sounds pretty straightforward. But when we take a step back from this debate, we see a much bigger political fracture slowly developing. Because from the perspective of men like Hayne and Calhoun, this tariff was a real inflection point for them. If the federal government in 1828 can pass a law that so clearly benefits one part of the country over another, allowing some Americans to further profit while others simultaneously suffer, what is to stop them from, say, in, 1838, from doing it all over again? And again, and again. Everyone could see the writing on the wall. The northern population was exploding. In the South, not so much. As time passes, the North was going to gain more economic, social, and political power. This was the moment for the South to take a stand and try to nip this eventual power shift in the bud as best they could. And of course, while they were genuinely worried about the real-time effects of the tariff, the bigger fear that really kept them up at night was the realization that eventually, if things keep moving in this direction, there could be a very real impact on slavery, the system that served as the entire underpinning of the Southern economy. So it wasn't just about the tariff. It was about the independence and sovereignty of the states in 1830 and beyond. And that sovereignty was critical, because without it, they knew slavery would eventually be an issue that wouldn't continue to be ignored by Congress. But conversely, Webster and his northern allies have similar overarching concerns about this debate. Yes, they believe the tariff was constitutional and the right thing to do. But if you listen closely to Webster's argument, you see that he is concerned about Southern uncomprehending perspective on the role and influence of the Union. From Webster's perspective, yes, you can argue that the states should be sovereign and that there is, under our federalist system, a balance of power between the states and the federal government. but don't be obtuse to the benefits of a powerful federal government and a powerful union of states. From Webster's perspective, you can't have it both ways. You can't take advantage of the protection, influence, credibility, and power that comes with being part of the U.S., while also demanding that you should have the right to be separate and sovereign from it. Many Northerners echoed Webster's sentiments, believing that a nation of united states was far more powerful than individual states acting in a confederation. I mean, haven't we already been through all of this? Does no one remember how many problems the Articles of Confederation caused? I mean, it was so ineffective they had to scrap the entire thing and create a whole new government. Am I taking crazy pills, or am I the only one that remembers all of this? Webster realized that if the South continued to hold strong to these arguments, profiting off of the power and influence of the U.S. abroad while undermining it at home, the division would continue to grow, and as he predicted, blood would be shed. Webster's extensive reply to Hayne during this debate was extremely powerful. His reputation as a patriot and incredible orator was only further cemented, and it was clear that while the Southerners may have believed they had a legitimate and constitutional argument, the tide of American opinion was in support of the nationalistic approach to defending the tariff. For defense of the tariff had now been morphed into a broader defense of the Union. While the immediate impacts of this debate were hard to define, this did set the stage for Jackson to now insert himself, take hold of the momentum, and make sure he followed it to its conclusion. While Jackson was the man in the White House, Thomas Jefferson was still seen by many as the Republican ideal of American politics. His birthday, April 13th, was celebrated every year by his fans. By doing this, they were very intent to keep the spirit of republicanism alive and well. And for the most part, ever since the era of good feelings and the dissolution of the Federalist Party, anyone with any type of political aspirations just fell in line and gave due respect to the great Thomas Jefferson. In the spring of 1830, interestingly enough, Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun had both planned on attending Jefferson's party. Now, at this point in their relationship, these two men, well, they didn't have much of one. Last week, we discussed in detail, or I should say 2 weeks ago, we discussed in detail the Petticoat Affair and explained how much tension had been created between these two men. Well, rumors had spread almost immediately that the anonymous writer of the South Carolina Exposition and Protest was in fact John C. Calhoun. And Calhoun wasn't able to persuade Jackson otherwise, because he wasn't even living in Washington, D.C. Since Congress wasn't in session, and constitutionally Calhoun had literally nothing to do, he was living down on his South Carolina plantation, just hanging out. While Calhoun was absent, Martin Van Buren did not waste the opportunity. He and his allies made sure they were always in Jackson's ear, sowing seeds of distrust between these two men. Jackson knew that he and Calhoun didn't agree on everything politically before he even chose him as vice president, but he had always hoped that he would be able to work together with him. With the constant stream of information from Martin Van Buren and his allies in Calhoun's absence, though, the trust between the two men had all but disappeared. So that leads us to the birthday celebration for Thomas Jefferson, in which, awkwardly enough, both Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun were going to be present. And everyone knew about this rift between Jackson and Calhoun. It was no secret. Additionally, both Calhoun and Jackson were being scheduled to give a toast that night. And as a side note, they weren't the only ones. There were about 24 people scheduled to give a toast that night. And while toasts are not as common today as they used to be a really big deal. Giving a good toast was a skill. It was an opportunity for you to get your message across about your perspective on a person or topic, or, as in this case, it was an opportunity to take a shot at a personal or political opponent. After the knockdown, drag-out debate that Webster and Hayne had in the Senate over nullification, people were excited about the possibility of a round two, this time potentially involving John C. Calhoun and or Andrew Jackson. One attendee, Thomas Banton, when overhearing the gossip at the beginning of the evening, observed that, quote, There was a full assemblage when I arrived, and I observed gentlemen standing about in clusters in the anterooms and talking with animation on something apparently serious, which seemed to engross their thoughts. I soon discovered what it was, that it came from the promulgation of the 24 regular toast, which favored of the new doctrine of nullification, and which, acting on some previous misgivings, began to spread the feeling that the dinner was got up to inaugurate that doctrine and to make Mr. Jefferson its father. Now keep in mind, Jackson was not clueless to this reality. He had read the list of men who were going to be making a toast, and he had already determined what their likely motivations were going to be, describing the dinner as a, quote, nullification affair altogether. With this, Jackson wanted to be prepared. He wrote down a few different responses that he would be able to offer during his toast and practiced them. He got feedback on which one was best, and he committed to it. After the men had all gone around giving their toast, sharing some of their nullification sentiments, all eyes turned toward President Jackson, who had the first opportunity to respond. This was a moment where people would get an idea of whether or not Jackson would be compromising with the South Carolinian nullifiers or not. Jackson, quietly and directly, replied, quote, our federal union, it must be preserved. Calhoun then had the floor, replying to Jackson that, quote, the union, next to our liberty, the most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefit and burden of the union. While a couple dozen other speakers added their 2 cents, everyone remembered only the toast from Jackson and Calhoun. And the stage was officially set for a showdown between Jackson and Calhoun. And keep in mind, Calhoun knew what he was doing. As I mentioned last episode, he was a really skilled politician. He knew the risk this posed to him. Calhoun could try to explain away the issues that cropped up from the Petticoat affair, but he wasn't going to be able to explain away a direct challenge to Jackson and the Union. And it's important to keep in mind that while Andrew Jackson was a Southerner and slave owner, and he did bring in this democratic wave of reform through the support of many small government-minded Southern and Western votes, he was a man who loved himself some America. Here was a guy who was involved in the Revolutionary War, the Creek Wars, was a hero of the War of 1812. He was a senator, the governor of Florida, and now president. He knew that the Union and everything it represented was formed over the last 50-plus years through the sacrifice of thousands and the efforts of even more. While he had his personal perspectives on the role of federal government, his appreciation of and confidence in the Union was unwavering. And the nullifiers in South Carolina were challenging that, publicly and directly. In fact, in one of his most famous quotes, I know sometimes it's hard to keep track of them, Jackson, relaying his message to a visitor from South Carolina, a message that he told this man he could carry back to his home state with him, said, quote, please give my compliments to your friends in your state and say to them that if a single drop of blood shall be shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man I can lay my hand on engaged in such treasonable conduct upon the first tree I can reach. Andrew Jackson was not backing down. After the Jefferson dinner, things were simmering, with Jackson and Calhoun not speaking for a couple weeks. But when they did, the momentum toward a resolution picked up once again. Jackson had received a letter from William Crawford, of all people, musing about some rumors that were being spread about Calhoun's immoral actions during the Seminole War. He mentioned to Jackson that word was spreading and it was making Jackson look bad. Jackson reached out to Calhoun to explain himself, and Calhoun was furious, indignant. He replied to Jackson more or less that while he respected Jackson personally and respected the office of the president, when it came to questioning his character and moral compass, well, Jackson could shove it where the sun don't shine. And look, Jackson reaching out to Calhoun about this behavior during the Seminole War wasn't exactly about the Seminole War. Heck, Jackson himself had been accused of some pretty terrible things during the Seminole War. This was about positioning Calhoun and his allies in a way that would justify getting rid of them. Last week, we spoke at length about the Petticoat affair and the impact this had on the relationship in the cabinet. Well, keep in mind that this drama was all still unfolding while the debate over nullification was raging. In addition to both the nullification crisis and the Petticoat affair, there was also a debate over the Bank of the United States that was heating up and dividing the cabinet further, something we'll dive into more deeply next episode. With the drama surrounding the Petticoat affair still swirling, the open and public nullification crisis, and the growing disagreements over what to do about the Bank of the U.S., Jackson couldn't take it anymore. His cabinet secretaries were constantly at odds with each other, while also pushing back against his agenda and vision for the nation. So, in Jackson fashion, he did something totally unprecedented. Now, Jackson wanted to just get rid of all of his cabinet members that were causing him problems, but he also knew he would get a lot of political blowback for such a move, picking favorites and getting rid of the ones he didn't like. Oh, and just real quick on a side note, President Andrew Johnson, the first president ever to be impeached, he was impeached for doing this exact thing. But anyway, Andrew Jackson hatched a scheme that I mentioned briefly last week. He, Martin Van Buren, and John Eaton decided that Martin Van Buren and Eaton would offer to resign from their post as cabinet secretaries. Having asked Eaton and Van Buren to resign, Jackson privately promised them support in future endeavors, with Eaton being able to go back to the Senate and Martin Van Buren minister to England and eventually Vice President of the United States. With the requested resignation of both Eaton and Van Buren public, Jackson now had the political cover to request the resignation of all other members of his cabinet. Now, there could be no accusations of Jackson acting in a blindly partisan fashion, and he was able to more peacefully achieve the, quote, rotation in office he had already become so well known for. Jackson, proud of his political scheming, reflected back on this, saying that, quote, "I have changed my cabinet and strengthened my administration thereby. What a contrast." With the legislative session ending, Jackson had months before he was going to have to nominate new cabinet members, which just made the transition that much easier. But with all of this going on in his cabinet, the issue of nullification still was not dead. The state elections of 1832 in South Carolina were a bit crazy, and as you can imagine, the nullification issue dominated the politics of the time. The nullifiers won in sweeping fashion and took their revolutionary enthusiasm into the state government. In November of 1832, they declared that the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 were unconstitutional and unenforceable. Not only that, but they began to put plans in place to have an army of over 25,000 men ready to defend their rights as a sovereign state if it came to that. Jackson, seeing this and having just wrapped up his presidential re-election, was sick and tired of the game South Carolina was playing and called them out publicly. On December 10, 1832, Jackson issued the Proclamation to the People of South Carolina, in which he described the nullifier's position as impractical absurdity and explained that, quote, "I consider, then, the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle on which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed." In 1833, tired of the game South Carolina continued to play, Jackson helped usher the passage of the Force Bill, which gave Jackson the power to use military force to collect import duties if South Carolina continued to refuse to comply with the tariff. This passed pretty easily through Congress, and now the pressure was on South Carolina to put up or shut up. Van Buren saw that while this may work, it isn't really a wise political move. He convinced Jackson that the best move was to pass another tariff, which they did, that gradually reduced the impacts of the previous tariffs that South Carolina had such issues with. With negotiations over a new tariff taking place, South Carolina begrudgingly set aside their ego and rescinded its nullification laws, only to then nullify the Force Bill. Yeah, okay, great job, tough guys. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider the broader perspective that was defined during this debate. Jackson and others knew exactly what this was all about, and he didn't mince words when he said that, quote, the tariff was only a pretext, and disunion and Southern Confederacy the real object. The next pretext will be the Negro, the slavery question. And boy, was he right. For during this time, the Southern wing of the Whig Party was created primarily to oppose Jackson, and in 1835, a gag rule was passed in Congress limiting the ability to debate the issue of slavery because tensions were rising so dangerously high. Next week, we'll take a look at another fight Jackson refused to back down from, the fight with Nicholas Biddle and the Bank of the United States. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.